Today we are going to be watching at least some of a video called Answering the Atheist, Stephen Hawking. This video is by Frank Turek with Cross-Examined. Frank Turek, of course, is a terrible Christian apologist. He is quite frankly laughable when he's arguing with himself, let alone when he's arguing with someone like Stephen Hawking. Now, of course, Stephen Hawking was not there, so it's really Frank Turek arguing with his straw man of Stephen Hawking. So let's check this video out, see what Frank Turek has to say and why it's ridiculous.
We said last night that the evidence leaves us with one of the following two options. If the universe had a beginning, it must have had a beginner. What are our two options? We said...
Okay, so if the universe had a beginning, it must have a beginner. I think that's kind of clunky language myself, but I get what he's getting at. I just don't understand the argument that if the universe has a beginning, there must be something bigger and more important than the universe to begin it, because you enter this recursive train of logic such as, well, what began the beginner? What exactly started that? Which, of course, they'll just say, well, God is infinite. He doesn't need a beginning. If that is so, then why couldn't the universe also be infinite in some sense? All we can really say is that our current space-time originated 14 billion years ago in a Big Bang. What we don't know is, was this cyclic? Had it happened an infinite amount of times before, and will it happen an infinite amount of times later on? We don't know the answer to that kind of question yet, and we are searching. We may never find it, but we are searching. So I think it's very premature to say the universe had a beginning, therefore it must have also had a beginner. But let's continue.
We said, number one, either no one created something out of nothing, which is the atheistic view, or someone created something out of nothing, which is the theistic view. Now, my question last night was this.
An interesting note here is that the way Frank Turek defines God himself is essentially as a nothing. He says God is spaceless, timeless, infinite. That is essentially the definition of nothing. So the way he defines God already has that big problem. He does add a couple of qualifiers to it, like omniscient and omnipotent, but an omniscient and omnipotent nothing is still nothing, isn't it?
Which view is more reasonable? That no one created something out of nothing, or that someone created something out of nothing? It's got to be someone, right?
No, not really.
And last night we said you can ask who made the someone, but that's certainly more reasonable than no one.
No, I don't think it is, but let's continue.
No one created something out of nothing, please. Nothing comes from nothing. Nothing ever could, right? Okay.
Actually, that is not the case. Scientists have determined mathematically and otherwise that in a perfect vacuum, particles essentially just pop into existence, collide, and then disappear into non-existence once more. Unless you think God is popping these particles out of nowhere, that represents a huge problem for the idea that nothing can come from nothing.
Okay, even Julie Andrews knew that. Didn't she sing that in some sort of Sound of Music movie or something? Nothing comes from nothing. So the much more reasonable conclusion is that someone created something out of nothing. And we dealt with the who made God question last night, so I won't go into that. No one made God. We know that. He's the uncaused first cause. And then we asked, if you want to ask a good question of an atheist, ask, if there is no God, why is there something rather than nothing at all?
I think the question itself doesn't make a lot of sense. If there is no God, why is there something rather than nothing at all? Well, if there is a God, why is he there and there is just a omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent being that exists with infinite knowledge and all this good stuff? I'm repeating myself a bit, but why is that there? Because to me, that question is no less pressing than the question he's asking. If the universe is such a profound thing that it needs a beginning that there was a beginner that caused it, why is the same not so of God? He implies he answered this yesterday, or whatever day before he did this one, but I don't think his answer then would have been really any good, so let's see if he re-answers it. I hope he does, because I'd like to respond to that, but let's see what else he has to say here. I'm not very convinced. I don't know about you.
If there is no God, why does anything exist? If the atheist says, well, the universe has always existed, therefore it doesn't need a cause, you would say what? Search! And add Kalam, cosmological argument. Second law, universe expanding, radiation afterglow, great galaxy seeds, Einstein. And then the Kalam cosmological argument confirms that. So The evidence points to the fact that space, matter, and time had a beginning. If that's the case,
the current iteration of space, matter, and time had a beginning. And for one thing, as I pointed out already, we don't know that this hasn't happened before or that it won't happen again in the future from this exact point. The universe, again, could be cyclical. Or there could be any number of other configurations. Other universes could exist and pop up all the time from nothingness. Now, the idea of nothingness, I think, is really hard to comprehend for humans. I think that's where a lot of the problem comes from, this idea of there being a nothingness. The human mind is no more fit to talk about nothingness than infinites. That makes it a very difficult subject to grapple with. I don't think our evolved ape brains were meant to ponder this kind of question, and the fact that we can in the first place is kind of amazing, but it's also kind of misleading. I have a friend named Sabrina. She's pretty awesome. Sabrina's explanation for why there is something instead of nothing is because it's probably impossible for there to actually be nothing. It's a very unsatisfying answer from the human perspective, where we look for reasons for things and logical chains. But it is a reasonable explanation. The universe is not here to satisfy us, so the explanation for why things are does not itself have to be a satisfying one.
the cause must be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial.
See, spaceless, timeless, immaterial, he is describing nothing. That is the definition of nothing, Frank.
All right? Now, that's what we did last night, and we ended on this slide. We said, how do atheists respond to this evidence? So now we're going to pick up from where we left off last night. Okay? You guys ready to go? Because you're going to say, well, Frank, that's just seems so rational here. If your evidence is good, it makes sense that in the beginning there must have been a beginner. But how do atheists respond to this? How many people have seen this book, The Grand Design by Stephen Hawking? Okay, a few of us have. This book came out about 6 months or so ago, and this book got a lot of press because...
As a side note, this video is something like 11 years old, so this happened a long time ago. Keep that in mind. This was pretty old, but worth responding to in my opinion anyway.
Stephen Hawking is a very well-respected physicist who has been around a long time, and Hawking is kind of a medical miracle. I don't know if you know much about Hawking, but about 40 or so years ago, he was diagnosed with what is called Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS. And Lou Gehrig's disease normally will kill you in a year or two. Well, here's Hawking, 40 years later, still alive.
That's actually correct. Stephen Hawking is, as far as I'm aware, he set a record for the longest a person survived with ALS, which is the official designation for Lou Gehrig's disease. He is, in a sense, a medical miracle, and he's not the only one. There's actually another one, Jason Becker, who was from a metal band called Cacophony, I think they were. Neoclassical, speed metal sort of stuff, really cool music. He later went on to, I think, be David Lee Roth's guitarist. And he is also still alive, I'm pretty sure. You might want to check on that. But Jason Becker, he's been alive for like 30-something years with ALS. He's still alive and kicking. So that's pretty cool, I guess. Like survival, you know, against these incredible odds. Lou Gehrig's disease usually does kill pretty fast. And these people are an inspiration to survive so long.
So he's sort of a medical miracle, brilliant man, and he wrote this book called The Grand Design with another author. Let's take a look at what he says in this book, because it got a lot of attention, and he is a leading atheist, all right? First of all, Hawking agrees that the universe had a beginning, and he cites much of the surge evidence we've already been through. He agrees with what we've been through so far.
I don't know what the surge evidence is, as a side note, so let's hope he goes into that at some point.
Secondly, he agrees that our universe appears to be highly fine-tuned for life.
Yes, because if it were not, life would not be here to recognize that fact. That in itself means very little.
And we're going to talk more about the fine-tuning here in a few minutes. I mentioned a little bit of it when we talked about the G in surge, the great galaxy seeds. But Hawking's already agreeing with that. Now let's go into the book and...
I suspect if he's talking about things like galaxy seeds, he's also terribly misinterpreting things like galaxy seeds and what they mean. This whole surge thing could be an explanation of how the universe came to be under the non-theistic worldview, However, again, I think he would probably terribly misunderstand all of that.
By the way, last night we had a question from a young lady in the back. She was holding her little baby, you remember, on this book. So let's go through this book in a little bit more detail. Here are some philosophical problems with the book. Here's what Hawking says. And before I put that up here, let me point this. One thing I like about Hawking is that he tells you exactly where he's coming from. He does not beat around the bush. He just says it in plain English. Here's what he says on page 34. This book is rooted in the concept of scientific determinism, which implies that there are no miracles or exceptions to the laws of nature.
As far as we can tell, there are not.
Now, what is scientific determinism? The lady here last night stated it very well. Hawking was saying, that every cause in the world, in the universe, is the product of a prior natural event.
And so far, that has been absolutely correct. See, these people like to rely on the God of the gaps, saying that our gaps in knowledge indicate a God. That is not the case. Just because we don't know something yet doesn't mean it cannot be explained. When it comes to all these questions of what caused the Big Bang and what was before it and stuff like that, we're actually working on that stuff. But of course, he wants to put God there, and considering the history of things, it'll probably be wrong this time too.
So there are no miracles. There are no exceptions to this. Everything is just a product of a previous natural event.
Correct.
Okay, that's called scientific determinism. What does that imply? First of all, this is a philosophical assertion, not a scientific conclusion. It begs the question in favor of atheism.
No, it isn't, and no, it doesn't. It may point to atheism as a consequence, but that is not a fair interpretation of what is being said here. What is being said here is simply that, as far as humans can determine, miracles do not happen. There are no exceptions to the laws of nature, as far as we can determine. We have scientific determinism as the default worldview here because it works.
Do you see that this is a philosophical conclusion he makes here? He can't learn this by doing some sort of experiment. This is not a scientific conclusion. This is a philosophical presupposition. He says scientific determinism is true, therefore there are no miracles, therefore atheism is true. How does he know this? Because he said so.
Well, he is correct. He is not wrong, so...
That's it. I just said so. It's an assertion. There's no evidence for this. This is just...
Except the preponderance of evidence which suggests that the universe operates in a natural and ordered way, and we don't really see what you would call the hands of God in anything happening in our natural universe.
Just a philosophical assertion. That's why I said last night, science doesn't say anything, scientists do. And if you're not good at philosophy, you may come up with bad scientific conclusions.
Or if you are bad at philosophy, like I suspect Frank Turek is, you may come up with bad philosophical implications and suggestions like he seems to do all the time.
This book that Hawking has written is just loaded with philosophical presuppositions that he can't prove. Atheistic philosophical presuppositions. Suppose some Christian said, miracles do occur. In fact, they happen all the time. And
prove it.
And then you ask the Christian why, and he just says, because I said so.
But that is essentially what Christians do. Science, unlike Christianity, has actual evidence to support it. There is nothing that supports the existence of miracles, but we can pretty well determine how the universe got where it is and from what, and we do not see signs of God in that process. The fact that it leads one to an atheistic worldview is merely coincidence in the sense that there is just nothing there promoting anything otherwise.
You'd say, well, what do you mean? Because that's an assertion. I need some evidence. He has no evidence for this. This is just what he says. Secondly, this also means that Hawking's thoughts in this book are determined. In other words, we have no reason to believe they are true. If every effect in the universe is a product of a previous natural cause, then so are his thoughts. His thoughts.
The reason why I think there's a problem with this is because they have this view of God as a supernatural entity. Now, they could work around this by saying, actually, God is a natural entity, not a supernatural entity. Then they could say that the idea of God does jive with what we understand of science. Now, I don't think that actually works, but that is a workable workaround. Yet they don't do this because they have to believe that God is a supernatural entity. If you look back at things the deists believed, for example, before we had things like evolutionary science and a good understanding of cosmology, they believed in a physical, natural God that created the universe and then just left. I find that idea inherently more respectable, but still as wrong.
Thoughts are the product of a previous natural cause, which means we have no free will, which means he's not really reasoning. What's he doing? He's simply a product of previous natural causes. He doesn't have free will. He's not really thinking. These thoughts are just coming to him because of some brain chemistry going on here.
Yes, that is correct. If you are saying that there is some kind of soul which gives you free will, well, you should be able to prove that in some way. But all studies so far done on free will have shown that you can actually determine the action a person will take seconds before they actually know they're going to take it. Something like 10 seconds in one study. That right there suggests something very uncomfortable, that free will is an illusion, that what we call consciousness is merely an artifact of a process going on in the brain, a chemical process which we do not actually have direct access to. We are essentially hallucinations. Yes, that is very uncomfortable, but if that is where the evidence leads, that is where the evidence leads. If he has evidence for the free will assertion, I would like to see that. But all studies done so far have shown that free will does seem to be illusory.
He's just molecules in motion. If that's the case, why should we believe what he says?
Well, maybe because his molecules are operating on an understanding of the cosmos that far exceeds yours. That seems like a pretty good reason.
This is what some might say a universal acid that burns everything up. It burns its own theory up. To say determinism is true is to say, well, how did I come to the conclusion that determinism is true? Because
I think Frank Turek himself is honestly great evidence for determinism. If Stephen Hawking and the things he says are all the result of brain chemistry, the natural laws working as they should, then it makes sense that somebody with his knowledge base would support these hypotheses. Likewise with Frank Turek, because he was immersed in the Bible, his brain chemistry is doing what it can and responding to that biblical worldview and structure. Actually, again, the existence of Frank Turek himself implies that, yes, we don't really have free will. It's just like, if we had free will, he could probably break out of the system a lot easier. He could probably see the holes in it more clearly, but he does not. I don't think that you could somehow say that will is free if you are essentially being determined your entire future, in many cases, by your experiences in how you were formed as a person. Free will is a very complicated subject, obviously, but I think Frank Turek is making kind of a silly argument here, because really, if determinism is true, he is acting exactly the way you would expect him to act.
because I had a previous natural cause it in my mind. Well, how would I know then what I'm really believing is true then? You wouldn't.
Well, yes, you could, because you would have to get outside of your head in some objective sense. That's where science comes in. Science is objective. Mathematics can say a lot of weird stuff, but one thing mathematics really can't do is lie, making them a pretty good predictor of how the universe works. Stephen Hawking is a physicist. Mathematics are his life. And so he has a pretty good window into the natural world and its workings, which Frank Turek does not, because he reads from a book written by people ignorant of the very things Stephen Hawking studies for a living.
So he's just given up the entire...
Well, studied for a living. He is not alive any longer, but he did study these things his whole life, so there's that.
entire show here by saying this. How can you be a scientist? How can you discover truth if this is the case? You can't. In fact, he says it on page 32. Free will is just an illusion.
Correct.
If free will is just an illusion, then so are his thoughts in this book, aren't they? This is a dream, basically. Well, why should we believe it then?
He is taking the determinist viewpoint and making it into kind of like a relativist viewpoint, which, it being deterministic does not make it relative. The fact that the universe works on a set of laws and everything else can be determined from those laws does not mean that any reality you wish to be correct can be correct. It's still operating on objective laws and objective realities. I don't know why he's having such a hard time understanding this, but from what I've seen of Frank Turek, I suspect he is not the most intelligent man. And I don't mean that as an insult, I just mean that as a basic truth of Frank Turek.
Do you see why you can't do science unless you know philosophy? These are all philosophical assertions, and if you don't pick them out, you're going to be, wow, how do I deal with Hawking when he gets to the end and he says, there's no God?
I think Stephen Hawking probably does, or well, probably did have a good understanding of philosophy. He was not just a science guy, he was very well read in general. He had quite an extensive knowledge base, and I would say there is a lot of philosophy in that knowledge base. Of course, Frank Turek doesn't know that or doesn't care, so he reads into it what he wants to read into it, i.e., Stephen Hawking as an arrogant scientist detached from philosophical questions. I don't think that's the case. I don't see any evidence for it. If anything, Stephen Hawking has been quite philosophical over the course of his career and works.
If you don't know philosophy, you won't be able to pick this out. Now he says that he asks a question here, and you're not going to believe, well, maybe you will believe it from what I just said, but check out this question that Stephen Hawking, the great physicist, asked. He says, do we really have reason to believe that an objective reality exists? What do physicists do? They observe objective reality, theoretically, and they discover what happens in the physical world, the objective physical world, right? Hawking is asking the question, do we even have any reason to believe that this physical, objective reality exists? You know what he says? What do you think he says? He says no. That's right. He says no, there is no model independent concept of reality.
Notice those are 8 pages apart, and I would like to see some context for what is between those 8 pages and indeed what is around those 8 pages. You can't really determine what he is saying from 2 snippets just taken at random. This is called cherry picking. It doesn't work for a reason. Now, when you refer to objective reality, it's important to question what exactly you are referring to. For example, is what I am seeing in front of me in any way representative of objective reality? Well, no, everything I see is merely how my brain interprets it based on what has worked evolutionarily over the course of humanity. What we see isn't the real essence of things, it's just how our brains process them. We do not have an objective sense of the reality around us, and this should be apparent if you understand how other animals work. Something like hawks having eyesight that's like 40 times more acute than humans. You know, species that see in infrared, or species that can pick up UV lights, which we cannot so well. So there are a number of things that suggest very carefully that we are not seeing the whole picture, merely parts of a picture interpreted by our brain to be convenient. It's convenient, but it's not really real. We are not seeing the essence of anything we're experiencing. And I don't see a problem with that. I think that would be what Stephen Hawking was talking about, but I would need context, which Frank Turek does not currently provide.
That's what he says. Now go back to what we talked about last night, the Roadrunner tactic, applying a claim to itself. If you apply that claim to itself, what do you get? You see, this is self-defeating. Is that concept of reality objective? Is it? It defeats itself. This also makes science impossible, because if there is no objective reality, what is the scientist trying to observe?
The irony here is that he is just making a bunch of assertions without actually showing us any of the texts that led him to these assertions. He's showing us small sentences, snippets here and there. He's not showing us the context that leads him to these assertions that he himself is making. That is a significant omission, and it is a bad way to argue with someone.
See, science is a search for causes. And if there is no objective reality, or let me put it this way, science is a search for causes in objective reality. If there is no objective reality, what are we looking for? And if everything in our mind is the product of a previous natural cause, are we even reasoning, or are we just reacting?
You can be both reasoning and reacting. You can be a reactive machine that also reasons. It's pretty clear that humanity both reasons and reacts, maybe just in a deterministic kind of way. I don't really see a problem with this, and I'm not sure why Frank does, other than his own personal ideology. But let's continue.
We're just chemicals. We're just molecules in motion. Remember we talked about this last night? Remember Kant said you can't know the real world? And we said the answer to that is, well, then how do you know that about the real world? Well, you might as well just put Hawking in Kant's chair, because this is what Hawking's buying into. He's buying into Kant. That's why I said last night, if you can't understand...
I don't understand the point of all these logical puzzles this guy mentions. Like, that is a great example of the kind of thing he does. I think he's trying to create contradictions where it may be valid to do so, but it doesn't really help us figure anything out, because in any statement a person makes, you can always find contradictions. There will be some way to contradict that statement, and just being able to contradict a statement doesn't mean you are correct in asserting the contradiction in the first place. How do you know that about the real world? Well, I don't think we can be completely sure about things like that. But that doesn't mean the assertion itself is invalid just because there are things we cannot know.
And Immanuel Kant, you can't understand modern philosophy, and now you can't understand Hawking unless you understand Kant. He's given up objective reality in order to say that there is no God, basically. That's what he gets to. That's where he's heading with this. I know this is kind of hard to believe when you think about it, but this is what a world-renowned physicist is saying.
Yes, it's kind of hard to understand and believe when someone like Frank Turek is explaining it and clearly hardly understands it, and is more interested in making petty points using lame contradictions. But I doubt his audience is really the kinds of people who are well-equipped for this discussion in the first place. These are churchy people. This is a church crowd. This is not a philosophy gathering. So really, even though Frank Turek may seem laughable in the amount of knowledge he has from our perspective on the other side, to these people he must seem like he actually knows quite a lot.
This is why Einstein said many years ago, he said, the man of science is a poor philosopher. The man of science is a poor philosopher. Hawking is a very poor philosopher. He's making elementary...
Again, I would like some citations here. I would like to know exactly what Einstein was saying, because Einstein said a whole lot of things, and I must point out that just because Einstein said it doesn't make it true. He was obviously a genius like almost no other in human history, but that does not make him right in all of his assertions, and he frequently made comedic assertions. He was something of a joker, you might say. He loved being ironic and witty and sarcastic, so he may have not really been saying what Frank thinks he's saying. Keep that in mind.
Mistakes in logic and making assertions that he can't prove in order to get to the conclusion he wants. But there's more, as you might imagine. Those are just the philosophical problems. What are the scientific problems in the book? Well, let's take a look. Here's what he says on page 9. Multiple universes arise naturally from physical laws. And then he goes on to say, because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. Okay, first of all, let's deal with the first, multiple universes. How do scientists, or atheists I should say, deal with the fact that the universe seems to be so precisely fine-tuned that there must be a designer out there? How do they...
That is not the natural implication of the fine-tuning argument, and to some extent... The problem is how the fine-tuning argument is phrased, that Christians can just make an assumption that it is talking about a fine-tuner. But that is not the case. It is merely pointing out that we exist in a universe where the conditions were correct, or at least favorable for us to exist in the first place. That from the perspective of us, it does seem fine-tuned because we can exist within it, and if you changed a certain number of factors, that would not be the case. If you changed some constants, that would not be the case. But we also have no idea for the real range of these constants. Maybe this is the only configuration in which they could exist. Maybe this is the only configuration for stable universes. Things like that. It does not necessarily point to a fine-tuner that the universe seems finely tuned.
They deal with that from an atheistic perspective. You know what their answer is? Their answer is, we just happen to be in the universe that appears designed. Because you see, there are many universes out there, multiple universes out there, and we're just lucky to be in the one that looks designed, even though it really is.
That is not what people say. That is a possibility, but that is not what is being claimed. Certainly, I don't think any physicist who thinks that multiple universes exist would say that they are all or mostly unsuitable for life. In fact, the same conditions that enable life may be the only conditions in which a universe can be stable enough to survive its creation process. That's just one hypothesis. There are plenty of others. His argument here is not genuine, and I don't know if he knows it, but it is not genuine.
Is it? Now, is there any evidence for this? No. The only universe we know about is the one we're in, right?
Well, not exactly. I think there are potential possibilities out there for other universes to exist. Scientists have occasionally suggested that there may be echoes of other universes in data from our universe. Beyond that, the fact that other dimensions clearly exist is a troubling thing, because the existence of other dimensions implies that there is nothing particularly special about our particular universal configuration, and therefore it can be easy to assume that because there are other dimensions that may be scattered on a much wider level than our own universe is, that other universes could exist as a result of phenomena happening within those other dimensions. Our universe probably did in some way spring from actions in another dimension, and there may be a lot of these dimensions. In fact, there may be other universes overlapping this one in other dimensions. These subjects are complicated, and Frank Turek is not qualified to explain them. For that matter, neither am I, but I do suspect I have a better understanding than he does of this particular subject, because I have spent a fair amount of time studying it, and it doesn't sound like he has unless he just wanted to respond to someone, which is not the way you go about learning information. When I read Christian theology, my thought is, okay, how do I use this to beat up on the Christians? That is not my thought. My thought is, how do I use this to make my own knowledge base a lot better? How do I make it more cohesive, more coherent? How do I understand something about the universe we live in better from this information? That's how you're supposed to do it. If you're doing everything for some end result, like to win an argument, that's not really learning, that's not really knowledge. That's ego, that's arrogance. It's no way to go about that.
There's no evidence for it. This is just what is known as a metaphysical speculation about ultimate reality, which Hawking has just said doesn't exist anyway. But you see, we get into these contradictions by even trying to talk about what these people believe, but they're trying to avoid a designer.
I keep looking at his audience to see if any of them are yawning as much as I am. I may just be tired, but to me, this whole discussion is laughable in an extreme, because this is not good. This is not a good way to argue, and I've said it before and I'll say it again. Frank Turek is not an excellent apologist. I am not a big fan of William Lane Craig, but William Lane Craig makes this man look like a toddler trying to argue his case. And that's kind of a problem. I hope Frank Turek has gotten better in intervening years, but I've seen newer ones, and he seems basically the same, which when you are talking to mainly an audience of people you agree with, that is often the outcome. That is the result. And it's very unfortunate, because Frank Turek clearly does have the desire and urge to learn and know more. It's just that because he is in somewhat of an echo chamber that appeals to him on some emotional level, he is blinded to the actual pursuit of knowledge and what it means. It's very unfortunate. I feel sorry for people like him, but in a sense, they do it to themselves, so I can't feel that bad about it.
So he says multiple universes arise naturally from physical laws, and he says, gravity will create us, or did create us. Now, what's the problem with this? First of all physical laws, including gravity, had a beginning and therefore need a cause.
Prove that. I don't see... That's just an assertion. You got to prove that. How do you know all physical laws, including gravity, had a beginning? Why would they need to have a beginning? What about them calls out for a beginning? This I would like to know.
Remember, we pointed this out already. Space, matter, and time had a beginning. So there was no gravity to create.
Gravity is what you might call an extra-dimensional feature, however. Gravity did not arise at the Big Bang, as far as we can tell. Gravity is probably something that has always existed in some form or another and always will, well beyond this universe. And the reason for that is that gravity is not a... It interacts with this universe, but it is not a feature of this universe. I apologize for messing up my sentence there so bad. It interacts with this universe, but it is not a feature of this universe. It is a feature of other dimensions. There's no reason to think that gravity sprang into existence with the Big Bang. There just isn't.
Create anything. Gravity was created. If gravity
Prove that.
was created, then gravity couldn't create us. And one wonders how gravity could create us anyway. Gravity is an impersonal force. Like, for example, when I drop this remote and it goes to the floor, gravity just does that. It's not thinking, if he drops that one more time, I'm not gonna pull that to the ground, right?
I am glad that he does recognize the existence of gravity, because some people on his team, flat earthers, do not accept it.
It's an impersonal force, does the same thing over and over again. It's not thinking, it's not making decisions, it just does the same thing over. It's an impersonal force. Persons can...
Why do you need a personal force to achieve a certain outcome? We know that in this universe, the result of gravity is certain outcomes. Stars, planets, things like that are created out of gravity. Black holes, which are a much more destructive force, but also had some ability to define their host galaxies and their structure. These things are the result of gravity. Gravity is what set the conditions for us to be here, essentially.
Make choices, and that's one reason we know that the beginner was personal, because only persons can choose to create, but
again, that's just an assertion. We see the results of gravity creating things all the time. Stars and planets do arise out of gravity. From planets arise life, as we can tell from this planet we are on. So yes, gravity does in fact lead to life, and we can observe these very processes happening in the universe around us. In fact, we do all the time, except for the life part, but I suspect life is probably fairly rare in the cosmos, even if the conditions are correct for it. And it turns out that there are a whole lot of planets with water and a whole lot of planets in the habitable zones of their stars. So the conditions are right, but maybe not necessarily right enough.
Impersonal forces make no choices. They just do the same thing over and over again. So to go from a state of non-existence to a state of creation, you have to make a choice. So the cause originally of the universe must be personal. Can't be gravity. Gravity was created anyway.
These are just baseless assertions. He's basing this on nothing. I know why he's doing it. It's just very easy to say, well, this is true, so this must be also true. But that is not the case. You can't just make assertions about things like this. You have to explain them, reason them. And these explanations, this reasoning, ignores a whole lot of factors. Gravity is not just, I drop my phone, it falls on the ground or into my hand. That's not all gravity is. Gravity can be a force of creation, and he is ignoring this, I suspect deliberately, to make his assertions. But again, his assertions are only assertions.
All right. Also, a quantum vacuum is not nothing. Non-being, it needs a cause. Now you're probably wondering, what's a quantum vacuum?
Prove that. Again, prove that. These are assertions. He's not actually proving anything. And honestly, at this point, I don't think this video is worth going on with, because as amusing as Frank Turek is in these situations, when it devolves into just making assertions over and over and not backing them up, there isn't much of a point to even responding, because all you can really say is no. And while it can be fun to just say no, it does get old very quickly if that's all you're really able to say. I'm having to explain many of the same concepts over and over, and I don't like that very much. So we'll call it here, and I will, of course, revisit Frank Turek again very soon. But that's all of this one. I'm having mercy on all of you, but I hope you enjoyed this one. If you enjoyed this long and winding road of absolute silliness, for some reason, please like the video. If you have something to say, comment, positive, negative, I'll take it all. I'll probably respond. And if you like this video a whole lot, please subscribe so this channel can keep growing and I can bring you more content like this. And most importantly of all, have a great day.